Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our next video for electronic music techniques. Today we're just going to dive a bit more into some MIDI sequencing and talk about a few other ways that you can sort of handle, record, edit, manipulate, and get some really cool musical and artistic results out of some MIDI information. So I have just a blank session here that I have loaded into Studio One, and I'm going to drag an instance of MIDI, and we're just going to work with this. Let's just go ahead and go to a preset, and I don't know, let's pick one of the lead sounds. Actually, you know what? Maybe let's try bell. Some of these kind of sound cool. Let's try this, I don't know, reso bell. That's cool, but that's not quite what I'm after. You know, I like that. It has a nice little attack. We can see that the actual shape of my envelope, you know, has a lot of bite to it. It very quickly turns up to a high amplitude, and then it sort of decays and gets out of the way. So this could work really well for being like a melody line, or maybe something that sort of goes with a melody, or adds some embellishment or some background articulation. It wouldn't be something that I'd necessarily want to use as like a bass line or like a you know, like a sustained pad sound, but for a plucky little line, works just fine. So here we have got this. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and record some data and then talk about a few different things that we might do with that data. So I'm gonna go back to my metronome here, and I'm going to make sure that it is set to do a pre-count, and then I'm gonna make sure that it does not click during play. I only want to hear it when I am actually recording. So I'm going to get 4 bars, and you know what? This 82 tempo is a little slow. Let's do like 102, and I'm gonna go ahead and hit record. Great. Okay, so the worst melody line ever written, but it gives us everything we need to talk about. Let's just play it back and see how it sounds. Cool. Okay, so what the first thing we want to talk about is this idea of quantization. So, you know, if you think about how computers work, they don't work like things do in the analog world. There isn't just sort of infinite amounts of time at which things could occur, right? Like we can take the second in real life and we can just kind of keep splitting it down into infinitely smaller and smaller units. So when we talk about like when notes happen, when you play them on a real instrument in real life, like an acoustic instrument, well, they can happen at any time, and the distance between them can be any time. And they're not, you know, relegated to any sort of grid-like structure like computers operate. So you can imagine that means that these MIDI notes do to some extent have to work on something that resembles a grid. And we can see that both up here in my edit view and also down here in the actual dedicated MIDI editor, that we have, you know, vertical lines that actually create some form of a grid. And this is sort of what I'm talking about with the idea of quantization. And if I play this back right now, we can see where my notes fall relative to the actual beats. So we can see that like from here to here is one measure, and this is measure 1 beat 1, measure 1 beat 2, measure 1 beat 3, measure 1 beat 4, and so on. And then we can see that currently we kind of have 4 lines between each beat, which would mean rhythmically we have 16th notes. The grid is showing upwards of 16th notes, and it's not showing any notes smaller. So if I hit play right now, you'll notice that a number of my notes do not line up perfectly with this grid, because I'm human, and when I play things, even with a metronome click, I can't land perfectly on every one of these little, you know, moments on the grid, each one of these little tick marks, so it's not going to be perfect. So let's play that back and hear what it sounds like. Yeah, so notice how it sounds pretty okay, but it's not perfectly in time. And in fact, here I kind of mess up. I kind of accelerate and then I slow down a little. So it's far from perfect. Now, whether perfect means exactly on the grid or not is an aesthetic question to raise, but for the time being, let's say we wanted all of these things to really line up on the grid and be perfectly in time. Well, luckily, we have an option for that, and that's what I'm talking about with this idea of quantize or quantization. So if I click the little quantize editor, it opens up and it shows me the most important features. One is, what is my grid value going to be? And then the other option here is apply. So a number of these options are also important, but for the most part, we really only need to focus on the grid size and the application thereof. So just to sort of demonstrate what I'm talking about, let's make sure I'm zoomed out here so I can see all of my notes. Notice that if I change my grid to like, you know, whole note, half note, quarter note, that the actual size of the grid can change. And this is especially true if I zoom in a little bit more. We can start to see finer resolution, and we can see all the way down. This is, in this case, being a 64th note. We have to zoom in pretty far if we really want to see. Notice that now my grid has like a really higher degree of resolution. I can keep decreasing this resolution to the point where I only have quarter notes showing, or all the way up to 64th notes. If you go to a really high resolution, like 64th notes, well, then that means that, when notes snap to a region, it's going to be relatively unchanged because your resolution is very high. So let me show you what I mean. Let's set my grid value to a half note, and then let's hit apply. And you'll notice that all of my notes snapped to their nearest half note. And a half note, well, that's just 2 beats. That's making up half the measure. So a couple of notes here, and then 1 note here. And then, in other words, I can only have notes at the start of a measure and on beat 3 of each measure. And it does not sound like I want it to. Far from what I had mere moments ago. Okay, so what instead if I kept the grid at the 16th note, and now what if I select apply? Ooh, now they moved just a little bit, and they all moved to their closest 16th note on the grid. Whichever line that represents a subdivision of the beat down to the level of the 16th, that's where they have landed. So what does this sound like now? And you know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to turn the metronome on during playback for the time being, so we can actually hear how close this is to the grid. Okay, so that didn't do the most perfect job compared to what I may have actually wanted. So it looks like this note, when I quantize at this level of the 16th, it actually moves the wrong way. So this is pointing out a really, really important concept with the idea of quantization, is that sometimes you can do too much. So maybe I like where these notes lie, or maybe I can just see, this note really belongs here. And this one really belongs here. Maybe that's quicker to do. Or I could notice that, I really just want these to land on the quarter note. So I could select these 3 notes, select quarter note, and then apply. And it only applies to the notes which I have selected. If I have nothing selected and I just sort of have the region populated in the editor, well, then it applies to everything. But I might want some notes to apply to some values while others apply to others. So maybe I make these 16th notes. Okay, that's, it looks reasonable, but it looks like they all got off by a little bit still. Yeah, those aren't right at all. And in fact, it looks like I could just move them over 1/16th note and that they're going to now be correct. Yeah, there we go. So I was not playing super perfectly in time, and as a result, when I snapped them to the nearest 16th note, they actually went back in time and went to the wrong 16th note. These ones look a little better. So still not perfect here. Yeah, I kind of want this, this looks like, and I can zoom in a little here. Yeah, so maybe I want, all 4 of these to just descend on the 16th notes. Or what actually might be the problem here, and this is the case, is that what I really want to have here is a rhythmic value that is not perfectly square. So you'll notice one other option that I have is whether or not these notes are straight, triplet notes, quintuplet, or septuplet. And, I want to divide this measure into maybe not 4 even sections. So let's undo a little bit and let's sort of keep these notes where they were. What if I select here and go 8th note, triplet, and now let's see what I get after I apply. Okay, so maybe not exactly what I wanted, but we can see that it divided it differently now into 3 even sections. And notice if I change the grid, the notes stay where they are. So changing the grid does not actually move things. It's only going to matter when I select this apply button, and that's determined by whether or not I have notes selected or whether I'm just sort of working in the actual region. So quantization is a really great way to get a sort of quick fix on the notes that you might be working with if they didn't line up the way you want. But I really want to stress that you still will often have to go in and make manual adjustments. You'll have to listen to what you have actually done via the result of this quantization, and you have to get practiced with what sort of resolution of the grid do I want to be working with at that moment. So let me show you one of my favorite ways to add MIDI data to a track. So right now I have this region, but as a reminder, if I had no region, I could always select my handy dandy paint tool or just select 5 if I want to, or in my case, I have it selected so that if I press Control, and if you're on a Mac, it would be Command, notice it's highlighted underneath because I've selected it to be my secondary tool here. I can hit Control and I can just draw a region out. So let's just go ahead and draw a little 4-bar phrase. And oftentimes, as nice as it is to, play MIDI in with the keyboard, right? I think it can be nice to edit it in one note at a time with what we call the step sequencer. So if I close my quantize window for a second and just open my step record option, I can now just sort of click in or punch in on my keyboard one note at a time without having to worry about sort of being stuck in a real-time musical performance with the metronome clicking and making sure I'm accurate. And this way I can also make sure I'm getting the exact rhythm that I want. So this is sort of like, the digital audio workstation's way of using like pencil and paper to actually kind of like write music out. We're gonna kind of have an approach like that. So, as a reminder, I can also still press Control and I can, actually draw things any time I want. So don't forget that option is there. You can use the paint tool as well in the actual MIDI editor. But I like this little step sequencer. And once I have this step sequencer selected, it lets me enter a note at whatever rhythmic value I select. So let's say I want to enter 4 quarter notes. I just want to make sure my playhead is wherever I want to start. And in this case, I'll place it at the beginning, and now I can just enter. Okay, now you'll notice something really important here. These are not perfectly lining up on the bar line because I have this selected as a triplet note. So I have quarter note triplets, but if I want to undo those, and let's say I just want to have them to be, more traditional 4 on the floor type quarter notes. Okay, now I have 5 quarter notes ascending. And they're perfectly with the grid, which is great. And then I could also, switch to any other rhythmic value at any time that I want. So as long as my playhead is where I want it to be, I can just start entering notes again. So maybe here I want to have a whole note, okay, and then maybe another whole note, and then maybe a couple of half notes, and then maybe a rest. And you can just click rest, and it adds that amount of space that you have selected. Then maybe some eighth notes. Now, I'm not saying this is the musical composition of the century, but it's a really intuitive, quick, and great way to enter notes, especially if you already have in mind the sort of rhythmic, pattern that you might be going for, or, how this melody will be realized or written out in time. I also find this is really handy for things like bass lines that might not have quite as many rhythmic differences between one note or the other. So if I'm doing like straight running eighth notes or like 4 on the floor with bass or percussion, this can be a quick way to sort of get that information in, make sure it's quantized and is sort of exactly where I want it to be. And now we'll have our rest. Okay, so again, not remarkable from a musical standpoint, but it's nice that this is here. Now, the inverse to quantization, which I talked about before, is the idea of humanizing, because quantized data like this, I mean, I know I didn't quantize it, but by entering it with the step sequencer, it's functionally quantized. It is on the grid, right? And you know what, these long notes I'm gonna delete, and let's just bring these over here. Let's bring these right here, and then let's extend this one note out. So we have one long note, and then we get our eighth notes. Okay, so I can, instead of quantize, because this is already perfectly quantized, I can select notes and I can do one of my favorite actions, which is under right here, or I can just right click any of the notes when I have them selected, and either under recent items if you've used it, or under musical functions. We're not going to explore all of these, but we'll look at several. One of my favorite ones is this idea of humanize. And the idea of humanize, and this is in most sequencers, you usually have an option to humanize notes. You're going to change the performance from being perfectly on the grid to not. So we can have a range of velocity that we allow. So if the velocity is like 100, if we put this at -10 and like up to 10, then it could go all the way from 90 like to 110. So we can set a range. Let's have a pretty wide range of velocities. And then we can also choose when the notes, if they are starting early or if they are starting late. And then it's going to sort of randomly change each of these notes that are here to fall within this range. You know, I'm going to shrink it just a little bit. But once I select OK with these notes having been highlighted and I select humanize, notice it was subtle, but you can see some changes in velocity and you can see some slight changes in timing. Let's even do it a little bit more extreme. Let's go humanize, and then let's do a really wide range for start and top and a really big range for velocity, and take a look at my velocities down here and subtle timing changes on the grid. Okay, so things move just a little bit, and as long as this particular synth is responding to velocity, which it will now, we'll hear subtle changes to dynamics and timing. Okay, so I think that's way more interesting musically compared to what I had before. I mean, certain types of music genres and styles, sometimes you want on the grid. It's just like the note hits with the grid, but other times you want it to maybe sound more human. And human beings do not perform perfectly on the grid. No matter how good you are with playing with the metronome, you're never going to be down to the nanosecond, just right with it. So why create that sound when we can have a much more natural, or in this case, humanized sound, which again sounds like so. Okay, so again, I think that is far more interesting. Now, a couple other things to mention in terms of editing this MIDI data to potentially make it more interesting. Over on the left-hand side, we have a few other options that we can use to sort of quantize this data, but in this case from a pitch standpoint. So as long as we turn this little scale option on, you'll notice that we can see the notes that are lit up of our scale, and in this case, we have a C chromatic scale, so every note sort of has a little blue line next to it, letting us know that it is part of that scale, because our C chromatic scale just is all 12 pitches. That's what the chromatic scale is. Right, those are all 12 notes of the C chromatic scale. But what if I just want to have all of these notes suddenly apply to a different scale? So what if I went from C chromatic to, I don't know, C harmonic minor? Okay, now notice nothing changed by default, and that's okay, except it does unhighlight keys that are no longer in that scale. So if you just want to sort of visualize what's going on, but you'll also notice that they no longer respond to click. So for example, E natural, I can play E natural on the keyboard, but I can't click it on the virtual keyboard here because it's not part of that scale. Now, if I want all of these notes to snap to their nearest C harmonic minor note buddy, if they are on a note that is outside that, all I have to do is once again right click, or if I'd like to, I can again go to action. It's going to give us the same options, and I can snap all of these notes to this scale by selecting apply scale. And you'll notice a few of them moved so that now I have a C harmonic minor version of this scale. Okay, now this is one of my favorite features, and other applications have varying degrees of randomness and scale shifting and all this, but I think it's fun to sort of take a melody line and try putting it in different scales or different key centers. So what if we did like F sharp, Phrygian, and then once again we can go to action and we can apply scale. Let's see how this sounds. Okay, I'm not saying that's perfect again, but it's kind of cool, and I might not have come up with those results on my own. So now I have this original line that I put in with the step sequencer, I humanized it, and I changed some of the pitch content with this pitch quantization, and I think that's pretty cool. We can also do things like make them snap to a particular triad sequence. So if I go to action and then apply scale, now they're going to stick to the F sharp major triad only. Or what about change the pitch and let's go to D and let's go to minor triad. And once again, I'm just going to right click this time and go apply scale. Now all these notes will snap to a D minor triad. Okay, so kind of cool options that I think give us some interesting musical ideas that we might not have come up with on our own. And I really think one of the things to take home from this class is the idea that, software should augment the way you create music. It shouldn't just be the same as if you're doing this acoustically or with pen and paper. You can use software to help generate ideas that you otherwise might never come up with. And all you have to do is to remember to audition them and be an artist and be selective, because maybe I use some randomization options to create this line. That doesn't mean it's done. It just means it's a way of creating something, and I have to react to it and decide, well, is this good? And if it's good, cool, you use it. If not, you try something else. So just to give you an example of some other randomization options, I'm going to keep this region here, and I'm going to just go ahead and put this back to C chromatic. I'm going to uncheck here, so we're kind of back to our standard scale. I can, in this action option right here, as long as I have this MIDI note region selected, I can select this cool fill with notes options. And I think this is kind of cool. If I select fill with notes, I can fill the whole part, which in this means the region I have selected. And I can choose various step lengths. So what type of notes can appear? How about we just do eighth notes, just regular eighth notes. We could have like quarter notes and half notes, and they could be triplets, and we could have dotted versions of them. It's going to pick random notes, but let's just do eighth notes for the time being, and let's do a relatively small range so it stays sort of in the middle. And let's say that the velocity starts at 50%. And yes, let's apply the scale. In this case, it's going to be C chromatic, so we'll get lots of notes, but let's just press OK. And look at this. Look at all these eighth notes I get. And I get, 1 eighth note per, sequence within the grid. Okay, so this isn't necessarily amazing, but let's go ahead and select them all. So Control A for me, or Command A if you're on a Mac. Let's go to Action, and let's go to Humanize, and let's see if we can make these sound a little more interesting. So let's make sure that there's a pretty wide velocity range and the timing of them. So let's press OK. Okay, now it should sound already more interesting. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Now, I kind of left some places in my grid a little bit weird from before, so we're getting a few little rhythmic errors in a few places. So let's just go ahead and make sure that, we kind of set this back to straight, and then let's go ahead and quantize these. Let's apply these all to the eighth note. So now they're all perfectly, once again, in line, at least to fix some of the rhythmic errors. And then let's go back to Action, and let's humanize these one more time for some timing. There we go. Now let's listen again. Okay, so that sounds kind of cool. Again, the humanization aspect is cool. Now let's pick something like, I don't know, D, and how about, once again, let's do a particular scale, but let's do something like the minor pentatonic scale, where we only have 5 notes, and then let's right-click, and let's do Apply Scale, and let's see how these sound. Now they're in a more selective sort of pitch collection, so they're going to sound, closer to what we might want to do to have this kind of effect. That velocity's a little high. Whoops. Just this one. Okay, so that's actually starting to be relatively interesting. Once again, I could select all notes, and if I go to Action, you'll notice I do have a few other options that you may want to play around with, one of which is just randomize notes, so I can select here and just completely go bananas. So we randomize like the lengths and the pitches and everything like that. This can be kind of fun. This can be especially fun if you have a kind of noisier synth sound or some really intense drum samples where you don't necessarily want things to sound on the grid or particularly traditionally musical, and you want to get kind of gnarly. So that is one other option that you might explore. So this MIDI editor is tremendously powerful. You can hit record, and then you can play your notes, and you can call it a day. Or you can quantize, you can use the step sequencer, you can humanize, you can snap them to a scale, you can randomize, you can fill with randomly generated notes to begin with, and you can end up with something that's really interesting that you otherwise might not have come up with. So again, let's just snap all of these to, I don't know, like a C sharp minor triad, and then once again, I can right click and just go to Apply Scale. That sounds kind of cool. And what if I went to my mixer, and what if I added some stuff here? What if I went to, PreSonus, and how about I go to one of my delay effects? Let's use beat delay. Let's pick a preset here. How about we try this marching chamber, and let's just hear what this sounds like. Okay, so that actually sounds pretty cool. I'm gonna go into MIDI real quick, and I can already hear that its little built-in reverb module is on. I usually recommend, and it's in fact required for your final project, but I would turn this off, and I would also make sure that in most cases this EQ is off. Today I'll leave it on just because I don't want to go through the process of reinventing this sound, but I'm going to turn off this reverb because instead of that, let's add a better sounding reverb. The room reverb from Studio One sounds pretty darn good. Let's pick a kind of cool, large space. Let's do, I don't know, like a parking garage. Let's see how this sounds. So you know what? That's honestly pretty cool, and I probably would have never come up with that exact sequence otherwise. Adding a little bit of delay is pretty cool. Let's, I don't know, let's increase the feedback and let's mix. Let's put more of this in. You know, I kind of like that. Let's insert another effect. I kind of like what we got going on here. I previously showed us this X-Trem plugin. Now, if I did a tremolo effect after reverb, that might sound kind of weird. So let's bring this all the way back up, and let's do this even before the delay. And rather than make it a tremolo, let's make it pan, and let's unsync this, and let's have it slowly, like real slowly, kind of with only a medium depth, move back and forth from left to right, so we get a bit of movement in this sound as well. So if you're listening with headphones, you can hear it move back and forth a little bit more, but that's a little slow. Let's speed it up just a little bit. Yeah, you know what? That's actually kind of cool. I dig that sound. I might have to use this. You know, that's pretty cool. I dig it. What else could we add here that might sound kind of cool to this particular sound that we have going on here that we have discussed so far? You know what? Let's just add a Pro EQ, and let's do that right before the reverb. And let's see here. I'm going to go back to this FFT curve and see what this sort of looks like. Okay, so it looks like this low end could just be cut because it's not doing anything. So let's get it out of the way. You know, I should probably just loop this. So let's do that. And let's loop that and let's play this. What if I have a high cut where we get rid of a lot of the upper frequency content? And what if over the course of this sound, we get a lot of this frequency content back? So as a reminder, if I want to automate this, just make sure it's the last thing I selected with my mouse and then hit Alt-A. And it creates an automation lane for us. So let's have this frequency cut off. Let's have it start like pretty darn low. Let's cut off just about everything. And then over the course of the sound file, let's have it open all the way back up. Let's maybe not start all the way down. Let's start like right about here so we have some sound. And let's have it sort of do a nice little more exponential curve. And let's hear all this frequency content come back as we hear the sound. So it'll get brighter over the duration of it. So that's pretty cool. Now, I know I expanded and added a few effects here beyond just MIDI, but that's because we've talked about most of the stuff I want to talk to about MIDI, and I want to really show you that, you know, once you make some notes and play around with the velocity and the timing and the humanization and the quantization, then you start adding some effects and add some motion and change the sort of spectrum of the sound over time, you really start to get some interesting stuff, even though, you know, harmonically, this is really boring. It's just notes of a C minor chord, but suddenly we've turned it in, or sorry, a C sharp minor chord. We've turned it into something artistically really interesting and exciting, and that's what's so satisfying about this sort of technology for generating music. We can't do this with anything else. So that is all for now in terms of MIDI. The only thing we will talk about in a future video is the pattern editor and a couple other cool looping options.